the Bardic tradition and the story of the stories. Now, for anyone who knows the kind of overview of Irish myths, there are 4 cycles of Irish myth. 2 are moderately well known and 2 are barely known at all. And the 2 that are moderately well known are the Ulster cycle, with a story from the Táin of Cuchulainn, and it's that Karina's been doing some wonderful work with her book on the women's stories. The other one that's cycle that's relatively well known is the Fenian cycle and the stories of Finn McCool. And the difference between the 2 is if Cuchulainn is the hero in the tribe, Finn is the hero outside the tribe. So the journey to join the Fianna is a sort of liminal experience of initiation, whereas Cuchulainn is the hero in the tribe defending the tribe. Now, the 2 cycles that are not very well known, one of them is the King cycle, and that pre the colonial or occupation period was a huge part of the Irish myth tradition. Something like 33% of stories, Daithí O'Hogan told me, were the King stories. Whereas post the colonial period, only 3% of the content of the stories was King stories, which kind of makes sense because if you're colonized, the one thing you're not going to tell stories of is kings. You're going to tell stories of rebels and how to get the current occupants out. Now, the area that we're particularly interested in is the mythological cycle, and that's going to be very central to this whole project. And the mythological cycle is potentially the area that you'd look to say, well, what is the creation myth? What is the creation myth of the Irish people? And the short answer is, there is no creation myth of the Irish people. There is no native story of the world and how the world came into being. So there's no, like in Babylonia, the salt water and the fresh water got together and created the first creatures, or in Norse tradition, how fire and ice got together and melted, and out of licking a cow, humans were created. Nor is the story of God created the world. So there is no native creation story of the Irish. And when you look at the mythological cycle, what you find is it is a series of invasions. And in fact, the first book of Ireland, in Ireland's body of compendium of stories, is Leabhar go Bhualla, the book of invasions. And if you step back and look at it, what you realize is that the Irish are the people who came from somewhere else. And there's a series of invasions, typically of people who came from areas where they were suffering from bad leadership or oppression or plagues. And they were, in a way, refugees. And they arrived in Ireland and to make something of the world. So in a way, the Irish have a really interesting, potentially global myth, which is that we're all people who came from somewhere else. We're all nomads. And if you asked a scientist to tell you what the typical DNA of an Irish person was, you would find that this is indeed the case, that there is in the DNA of the Irish people from here and people from there and people from everywhere. And then, having arrived, they'd often exile themselves or be exiled. So it's a case of coming and going and coming and going. But the particular common ground is that they would have been people who suffered from bad leadership, tyrants and dictators. And so any form of wisdom and leadership and governance that they come up with is likely to be informed by, well, we're certainly not going to be like wherever we came from. And the kings and the queens that we build into our mythology are in a way going to be not whatever they've experienced elsewhere. So essentially, there is a body of stories which is in the mythological tradition. And they are, for those of you that have been with us before, you'll be very familiar with them. The story of Cessair or Casir, which is another probably more true to the Irish pronunciation. And that is that we're, many of us, very familiar with this extraordinary story from Meroe in northern Sudan, the cradle of civilization. Look it up on the website if you haven't already, and you'll find that this place you've never heard of was once indeed a place of great pyramids. And she set off through on a journey that makes the Odyssey look tame in comparison, 10 times longer, and headed through Egypt, Babylon, Hebrew, Greek, Roman, Celtic, German, and arrived in Ireland with the mothers of the world to establish a very feminine foundation. It was the mothers of the world and 3 women. So, but it wasn't a sort of creation story. It was a sort of arrived from somewhere else. And for those of you who know the story, she was not allowed on Noah's Ark because she had some bad company who was reputed to be thieves. And so what that meant is her likely immediate demise. But she didn't sit around feeling sorry for herself. She found her agency, built 3 arks, and we know what happened. She set off to a land that was pure and arrived with her lover Fintan and the mothers of the world. And that is a story that many have found exciting. And we then move on, and I don't really want to go into it in any great depth, but it's the Partholonians who brought the 3 great industries of Ireland: tourism, agriculture, and brewing, before them being wiped out in a play in Tallaght, which is just up the road from where we live. 9,000 of them were wiped out. And then you got Nemed and the Nemedians, and they carried on building infrastructure, but they were also the victims of oppression and had to exile. The Firbolg are very interesting because they are the bagmen of the world, the hobbits of the world, and they were the first to come up with a form of organization or governance, and that was this wonderful idea of distributed power and the provinces, which is Cuaige. Why province? Why 4 when there are 5? Because we have this idea of the 5th province, which we're going to come back to, because that in itself represents a very interesting idea to do with the cult of the sacred center. And then finally, we have the Tuatha Dé Danann, who arrived from the north with their gifts, Nemedians returning, and they were people of magic, but more than anything, they were the goddess people, the people of the goddess Danu. So these are the stories, and they are not creation stories in the usual sense of the word. They're arrival and leaving, arrival and leaving. Now, what happened in the 7th century was, in the words of one of the great scholars of this area, John Carey, a laborious attempt was made to combine this native or nativist tradition with Hebrew, embellished with medieval legend. So what essentially happened is the native tradition was severed at the stem. So you can imagine a tree. The tree was chopped, the roots were left, and the top of the tree was put on another set of roots. Or you can imagine you've lived your life for a while and someone says to you, your parents are not your parents. You have another set of parents and they're over here. And by the way, they come from the Middle East and the Far East. You are not who you are. So the native tradition was now grafted on to Christian roots. Now, the Christian roots that it was grafted onto was the universal story that was spreading around the world that had very much to do with the Old Testament, and particularly Genesis. So what essentially happened is this nativist tradition of this shamanic and goddess culture, stick this on top of the Hebrew story, which we know very well, and it is God created the world in 6 days and then rested on the seventh, and then we have the Garden of Eden, and we have the Moses story, and we have the Tower of Babel, which I'll come back to in a minute. So essentially, this happened as a result of the work of scholars at the start of the 7th century, which was to create a legend that basically linked the Irish people into God's revelation and creation of the world. Now, what then happened is in the 11th century, the Leabhar Gabhála was pulled together by an Irish scholar, and he created a sweeping, unified account of the origin of Ireland and the Gaels. And essentially what it was a putting together of these two very different mythologies with a very different feel. Now, one of the things we learned from James Carey is that these stories were extremely important to the Irish. So asking a question as to whether these are true or not is less relevant than asking, were they believed? And this is what was the situation. For about 1,500 years, this was the story of the Irish. It was a pulling together of these two traditions. And it is, when you read Leabhar Gabhála, a kind of clumsy putting together. Now, what then happened is it almost felt like these myths, particularly as we move into the 16th, 17th, and 18th century, kind of were pushed to one side. And, almost with the demise of Gaelic culture, they were little known. And we kind of know the myths that were wheeled out in 1916 and 1920, and it had a lot to do with the self-blood sacrifice of Cuchulainn. So essentially, these stories weren't that well known. Well, that's not entirely true, because the Hebrew stories would have been well known because of the central role of the Old Testament in the Catholic Church and in the Christian tradition. But the nativist tradition would not have been well known. And in a way, that's a pity, because what would Ireland have been if, when it got its independence, it went right back to these stories of imaginative stories of the goddess and the shamanic culture, and stories of Cessa and Partholon and the Tuatha Dé Danann, and a female-oriented justice system and all that is inherent in that. But it was only when an R.A.S. McAllister, the chair of Celtic archaeology in UCD, wrote 4 volumes for the Irish Text Society that came out in 1939 and 1942. So it's almost as if these stories were not available widely. And even those that were had recension 1, recension 2, and were quite hard to read. So essentially, this whole body of stories about these people who came from somewhere else, and particularly the story of Cessa, weren't very well known. Now, I remain to be corrected. If someone's got another perspective, please throw it in. But there was one problem with the Hebrew tradition, which is that there were no Irish at the Tower of Babel. So the medieval writers came up with a character called Phineas Farsed. He was a legendary king of Scythia. And if you look up where Scythia is, it's kind of north of Ukraine and north of Turkey. So it's very much the Middle East. But he was said to be descended from Noah. And what happened is he and his son Net traveled to the Tower of Babylon, where they found that all the people that had been at the Tower sorry, not the Tower of Babylon, the Tower of Babel, the speakers had dispersed. They weren't there anymore. And why had that happened? Because God was a bit upset because they all spoke the same language. And they, if they all spoke the same language, were in danger of rebelling. So God, according to the text, had a divide and rule strategy and dispersed the peoples at the Tower of Babel to all the corners of the world to get immersed in all the languages of the world. So it was a very much a divide and rule strategy of this God who we've seen because of the flood and because of how Adam and Eve were treated is a fairly punitive God. But he was also an insecure God because what he did was send the people at the Tower, the peoples of the world, off to the corners of the world, because if they all spoke different languages, they couldn't challenge the power of God, of Yahweh. Now, what did Phineas do to this? He and his son arrived with 72 other scholars, and they were great linguists. And they created a school. So it's the first sort of bardic school where they collected the languages of the world. And Phineas Farsed and his scholarly friends discovered 4 alphabets: the Hebrew, the Greek, the Latin, and a 4th, the Ogham language. And out of these 72 languages, and this is what the book says, the Laogawala non-Book of Invasions bit of it, says that out of these languages, the Gaels, out of these 72 other languages, Phineas cut the language of the Gael. So the first European language is the Gael's language, which kind of makes the Irish the first Europeans. They have impeccable European credentials because they were the first to create a grammar of their own. They have a saint called St. Columbanus, who's standing up to the great European Saint Benedict. And apparently the Irish doctor was the greatest doctor in the whole of Europe. So Ireland in this mythic history was impeccable in terms of its European credentials. But now what did we have to do? We had to get back to Ireland with this language. And what they then did is pick up the story of the sons of Mill, which is what Fiona's going to tell us in a little while, which is essentially the arrival of the Celts in Ireland. And what in the Laogawala version of it is it begins in Egypt, where the sons of Mill had a row with the Pharaoh, headed to Crete, headed to Spain, and then arrive in Ireland, and we're going to hear later, effectively defeated the goddess people at the Battle of Taltu and were dispatched underground. So the culture of the goddess went underground as a result of this arrival, and we have the Celtic peoples in the form of the sons of Mill, and we also have the Old Testament Hebrew tradition. By the way, one of the things I have to say is I do think there's a completely different feel to the Old Testament and the New. It's almost like, to me, they're almost like 2 different mythologies in terms of their feel and their worldview. And it feels to me that there's a huge contrast between the Old Testament, and let's run through some of the difference between the nativist feel and the Hebrew. The world of the nativist is a world of gods and goddesses. the world of the Hebrew is monotheistic. It's an all-powerful, vengeful God. The justice in the nativist tradition is restorative, whereas in the Hebrew tradition is retributive. Clearly, the nativist is polytheistic, whereas the Hebrew is monotheistic. And what we learned on the Sessa creation myths is that they reworked the myths of Babylonian to create an impression of monotheism. So essentially, these skillful myth makers create worlds through working with these commonly known stories and often reshaping them to their own ends. So myth making or world making, which we see today with some of the dictators and tyrants, are very skillful at it. In Trump, the 45th president, and Putin, they create imagined worlds very compellingly by working with cultural myths. That skill is not a new skill. It was very much evident in the scribes and the myth makers. The modus operandi in the nativist tradition was search for unity, and balance was incredibly important. You recall the kidney in the fifth province, which is a symbol of balance, whereas the Hebrew was divide and conquer. The emotion in the Hebrew tradition has to be one of fear, whereas there's a different feel to the native tradition. Yes, they are wary, but generosity is the central emotion. There's a masculine feel in the nativist tradition, whereas it's a feminine feel in the nativist tradition, a masculine feel. The central archetype in the Hebrew tradition is the strong man. We see a lot of those in politics these days, but the DNA of that is well laid out in the Old Testament. Whereas the nativist tradition is wise men, people like Finn and Fintan MacBochna and Dagda, and strong women, as we've seen from Karina's wonderful work. And the central gift of the divine in the Hebrew tradition is obedience to these 10 commandments, whereas the nativist tradition we learned from Bran, it's about perception. And silver branch perception, the gift of seeing and seeing the world. The central focus of the nativist tradition is balance, and in the Hebrew is control. So essentially what we've got is a nativist tradition, and I've tried to outline some of the central features of it, with a universal tradition, which was spread around Europe, and there's a number of books that were central in doing it, and that is superimposed, and the stem of the nativist tradition is cut off. And what we're going to see as we move through this series is how these two nativist and universalist traditions intertwine. And in relation to the scholars' work on this, there's a body of scholars who basically say the nativist tradition was a makey-uppy. So if that's the case, there's no such thing as a native Irish tradition. But there's another body of scholars argue very strongly that no, this nativist tradition was a very powerful oral tradition passed on from generation to generation through the profession of the bards and the fillies, and it was the collective wisdom, and the collective wisdom particularly of people who had been booted out of other places and created their own mythology. But we do have the two together, and they've played a critical role as we move through 5,000 years of Irish history, the pre-Celtic period, the pre-Christian period, the pre-Viking period, the pre-Norman period, and the pre-Tudor and Scots period, and then into independence. So we're going to look at these two almost very different mythologies and how they play out in Irish history, really. And so what we'd like you to do is go into your small groups and just chat about what you have been through, what I've just taken you through in terms of the foundational mythologies of Ireland. So into your groups for about 10 minutes or so.